You are Edward, right? The guy who used to run training? That was the question a new hire tossed at me while I was digging printer toner out of a dusty cardboard box at 7:42 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday. Not Director Vance. Not even Mr. Vance. Just the guy who used to run training, as if I were some faded office landmark that had outlived its usefulness. I simply offered a quiet nod. I had spent 12 years building the foundation of this company, establishing its hiring protocols, onboarding systems, and development plans. I wrote the employee handbook before the Human Resources Department even knew what an organizational chart looked like. Now I was squatting next to a supply cabinet, getting mistaken for the office help. Welcome to people development, the department everyone ignores until morale collapses or a major lawsuit lands on the front desk. The corporate office of Vanguard Systems was a sprawl of steel, glass, and expensive ergonomics, but the supply cabinet where I stood felt like a dungeon. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit overhead, a steady, monotonous drone that had accompanied my entire 12-year tenure. I did not need applause, I never did. But watching executives I had trained promote each other over expensive drinks at local whiskey bars. While I received standard store-bought cupcakes in the break room was a specific flavor of corporate humility. I stayed because I believed in what I had built. I believed that development was not just overhead, but a long-term legacy. Unfortunately, legacy does not show up on a balance sheet, but layoffs make for excellent bar graphs. The jokes started around year 5. They would say that Edward was a lifer, the king of the onboarding jungle, and that nobody should cross him because he probably had files on everyone. I smiled through those comments, letting them believe I was just a harmless office uncle who brought donuts and organized sign-in sheets. Let them forget that I had access to every executive's behavioral assessments and exit timelines. Let them overlook the equity clause I had negotiated back when the company was in its infancy. Back then, the founding chief executive officer was still using a personal email account and begging us to take equity instead of cash bonuses. Most of the other managers laughed and sold theirs off at the first opportunity. I kept mine, quietly and carefully. By year 8, they stopped joking and simply forgot I was in the room. Meetings went from let us loop in Edward to who owns training now, like I was a ghost haunting the calendar invites. I watched 5 different bosses cycle through above me. All of them were obsessed with click-through rates, efficiency metrics, and modern culture upgrades. All of them were temporary. I outlasted them all like stubborn coffee stains on a desk. In year 10, I stopped waiting for recognition. I started investing in my own growth since the firm never would. I spent my weekends on virtual calls with corporate governance consultants. I hired a private career strategist out of my own pocket. I paid for an executive leadership program with a name so pretentious I had to lie and tell my colleagues it was a fishing retreat. They thought I was trying to find myself, and they were right. The real discovery was a clause buried deep in my original contract, a right of first refusal on any voting structure changes, signed when we had fewer than 50 employees. It was a clause the current board had completely forgotten, but I had been quietly reinforcing through documented approvals, internal alliances, and training programs that happened to emphasize legal and fiduciary accountability. By year 12, I was the institutional wallpaper. I was the person they blamed when the messaging channels failed or a training presentation had a typo. I said nothing when they brought in the new chief financial officer with a massive startup ego and a private boat he liked to post on social media. I said even less when he snuck a strategic advisory fee into our diversity training budget. I simply logged every invoice, every receipt, and every sarcastic comment made about my department. I smiled. Because people like me do not scream when a fire starts. We just pull the fireproof records from the drawer, review the bylaws, and start planning a new ending. The new chief executive officer, Gerald Finch, arrived in a storm of buzzwords and expensive cologne that smelled of eucalyptus and regret. The board practically kneeled before him before he even walked through the door. Disruptive leadership, they called it. He was younger, louder, and completely untethered from the actual mechanics of the company he was supposed to run. His handshake was firm, his smile was surgically white, and he introduced himself by stating that we were not here to maintain, but to dominate. 3 days later, he brought in Bradley Stone. Bradley was 28 years old, possessed a business degree, and had all the emotional intelligence of a paperclip. He wore tight suits and looked like he had edited himself into his own business cards. His title was Chief of Strategy Implementation, and his mission was to optimize what he called legacy overhead. I became an expert in Bradley within a week. He held a reorganization meeting where he replaced all department names with useless acronyms. People development became human potential excellence. My team looked at me like frightened crew members on a sinking ship. I did not have the heart to tell them we had already struck the iceberg. When a manager like Bradley Stone starts asking how much redundancy is built into a department, what he really means is how fast he can gut your team without the building collapsing within 2 weeks. My calendar was wiped of strategic meetings. My budget requests went completely unanswered. My system permissions were downgraded without a single word of explanation. Then came the email from Bradley's assistant titled Updated Scope, Urgent Signature Required. The document was 2 pages of corporate jargon dressed up in marketing prose. Buried in the middle was the real blow. My authority over training, onboarding, and departmental policy would be transferred to strategic operations for streamlined oversight. I was being turned into a corporate mascot, a smiling figurehead for a program they had already gutted. I read the document twice, laughed once, and forwarded it to a trusted lawyer on retainer. She replied with a single sentence, "Do not sign, not yet." Behind closed doors, Bradley grew colder by the day. In leadership reviews, he would interrupt me mid-sentence, telling me to keep things future-facing. If I mentioned past data, he would remark that we were not running a museum. He was a man who loved whiteboard sessions. He would spend hours drawing arrows pointing upward, gesturing aggressively with dry erase markers as if he were leading a military campaign rather than trying to cut the travel budget. The junior managers would nod in unison, terrified of being labeled as legacy thinkers. During one quarterly review, he leaned across the mahogany table and said that while I was brilliant at creating historical systems, those systems had grown stale, and they needed lean energy now. I simply smiled and took a sip of my tea. It was a good thing I knew how to handle dead weight. He did not laugh. He never understood my dry humor. The team I had mentored for years was dismantled overnight. One manager was transferred to a product role for cross-functional development. Another was forced into a lateral move in the supply chain department. One analyst was simply gone, leaving his favorite coffee mug in the break room dishwasher. I was not even notified of his departure until I saw the empty desk. The final straw came when they physically moved my workspace. My corner office with the glass walls and the potted fern I had kept alive for a decade was reassigned to a new consultant named Beatrice Thorne, who specialized in return on investment accountability. I was given a small workstation right next to the communal printer. I had no door, no fern, a constant drift of toner fumes, and a direct view of the hallway where Bradley marched past every day like a hall monitor. He stopped once, leaned on my partition, and said he hoped I was not too attached to titles, as they were all fluid now. I looked up and told him I had never needed a title to do damage. He grinned, assuming it was a joke. That was the moment the confusion faded and the hurt hardened into a deliberate plan. I had seen young executives like him before. They think office politics is a game of chess, but they play like children, knocking over the pieces when they start to lose. What they did not realize was that I had built the board itself. I knew which tiles were secured and which ones triggered the trapdoor. I did not raise my voice, and I did not complain in the parking lot. I simply called a colleague in the legal department who owed me a favor and started reading the company bylaws line by line, focusing on everything they had overlooked. I first noticed the financial manipulation when a monthly expense summary landed in my inbox, looking like it had been run through a corporate blender. Line items that once read as leadership coaching or compliance training protocols were now condensed under vague labels like operational support flow and intangible resources. It was a financial word salad, and Bradley was the one holding the spoon. The catch was that my name was still attached to the original approval chains. Every line they now labeled as non-essential had once passed through my hands back when the company believed that developing people was worth more than placing slogans on water bottles. Now, those old expenses were being turned into weapons against me. A week later, I received an email from the audit review team asking for clarification on several transactions dating back 3 fiscal years. There was no direct carbon copy to Bradley, but his signature style was all over the message. They wanted to know why I had approved a series of coaching sessions with an external consultant and whether it was justified in terms of return on investment. One of the managers trained by that consultant was now running our European division, and another had successfully negotiated our largest vendor contract. Yet they wanted to debate a $1,400 invoice, while Bradley was approving a six-figure budget for his new Synergy Acceleration Pod, which was nothing more than a rented shared workspace with a beanbag chair. I did not answer the email immediately. Instead, I started printing receipts, approval chains, and slide decks where Bradley had placed his name on frameworks I had designed years earlier. I formatted my personal backup drive, organizing the files with absolute precision. That weekend, I drove out to the lake house I co-owned with my sister Grace Vance. With no internet connection and no corporate chat notifications, I spent 48 hours sitting at the wooden table. With 2 legal pads and 3 bottles of red wine, I made a list of every budget Bradley Stone had touched since his arrival. I cross-referenced them against legacy expenditures, highlighting every deviation and renamed category. The pattern was undeniable. He was quietly erasing the company's institutional memory, replacing it with buzzwords and spreadsheets that no one would question until the system broke. The lake house was quiet, surrounded by tall pine trees that filtered the autumn breeze. It was a place where my sister, Grace Vance, and I had spent summers since we were children. Grace was a CPA who understood corporate finance as well as I understood compliance, and when I showed her the files, she did not hesitate to help. We spent hours mapping out the financial connections. I thought back to the early days of the company when the original founder and I sat in a drafty warehouse drinking cheap coffee and arguing about coding protocols. He had given me that equity because I was the only one who kept the servers running and the contracts clean. He had valued loyalty, a concept that seemed entirely foreign to the current board. I also drafted letters to the 2 retired board members who had both retired to the coast. I had helped secure their retirements by auditing their vesting contracts years ago, and they were more than happy to sign their proxies over to me. They trusted my judgment, and they hated what Gerald Finch was doing to the firm's culture. The doubts crept in when I reached out to Human Resources to confirm my title in the organizational chart. The representative became quiet before saying she would have to check and get back to you. That was when I knew the pieces were moving. I called my attorney, who told me to save every version of every email. If they were building a paper trail, I needed to build a smarter one. The next morning I walked in to find my office nameplate had been replaced. It no longer said director. It read advisor, talent continuity. I had received no notification, not even a brief message. I laughed out loud, startling a nearby intern. I took the nameplate and slid it into my bag. That afternoon I received a warning. I was in the stairwell heading to the roof for a phone call when Clara Jenkins, a junior manager on the marketing team, called my name. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around. The air in the concrete stairwell was cold and smelled of damp dust and old paint. I gripped the iron railing, feeling the vibration of the building's machinery through the metal. It was a physical reminder of the heavy, complex machine I had helped maintain for over a decade, which was now being steered by amateurs. Clara handed me her phone, displaying a live discussion channel that someone had forgotten to restrict. The message read, "Let us finalize the package and schedule the termination before the fourth quarter kickoff, preferably on Friday. We do not want legacy noise dragging into planning." The message directly above it asked if they had confirmed how to disable access for Edward Vance. I handed the phone back. Clara nodded quietly and walked away. I stood in the cold stairwell for a long time, realizing they were not just changing my title. They were preparing to erase me entirely. I spent the rest of Sunday evening organizing my final files. The first folder was labeled Voting Rights Legacy Clause. Inside was my original agreement from 11 years ago, signed by the founding chief executive officer and 2 original board members. That clause granted me the right to amend and co-sign governance policies in lieu of cash bonuses. The current board had forgotten it existed, but I had not. The second folder held my shareholder confirmations. I owned 34.1% of the company's equity. Combined with two trusted retired executives I had mentored, we controlled just over 51% of the voting power. A silent, patient majority. The third folder contained my records of the training budgets. Every dollar was documented, pre-approved, and tied to legal compliance. The fourth folder held the drafted bylaw revisions that the board chair and I had quietly worked on months ago under the guise of operational efficiency. The revisions redefined voting procedures and shifted executive oversight to the shareholder majority in the event of leadership misalignment. The fifth folder held the agenda for Monday's board meeting, where I was listed to present. The final folder was blank, containing only a single sticky note that read Phase 2. I also compiled a file on Bradley's financial activities. I discovered he had authorized a $27,000 payment to an unvetted consulting firm called Performa Group LLC. The firm was registered in the state of Ohio to a man named Jared Webb, who happened to be Bradley's college roommate. Bradley had bypassed the standard vendor approval process by forging the digital signature of our former chief financial officer, Howard Miller, on the contract. This was a clear violation of California Penal Code Section 470, rendering the entire transaction void ab initio due to fraud. Furthermore, the performance report Jared Webb had submitted was plagiarized word for word from a public McKinsey study, which constituted a direct copyright violation under Title 17 United States Code, Section 106. I printed copies of the registry, the forged approvals, the plagiarized pages, and the wire transfer receipts. The trap was set. They called me into the glass conference room at 9 o'clock and 1 minute on Monday morning. That was how they operated, early enough to avoid office gossip, but late enough that someone else would handle the paperwork. The calendar invite was titled Strategic Realignment Touchpoint. The glass walls of the conference room were frosted with a corporate logo pattern, offering an illusion of privacy while allowing the rest of the office to watch the execution in real time. It was a stage, and Bradley was determined to play the role of the modern executive to perfection. I did not bring my laptop or a notepad, only my favorite black fountain pen. Bradley Stone sat at the head of the table in a blue suit, looking like a young executive auditioning for a television drama. A human resources representative sat beside him, holding a printed packet with my name in bold letters. "Edward," Bradley said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Thanks for coming in." I remained standing. He sighed, adjusting his collar. "We have concluded that your role no longer aligns with our strategic direction. Effective immediately, your position is being eliminated." The representative slid the packet across the table. It made a soft sound against the wood. Bradley added that this was no reflection on my past contributions, but questions had arisen regarding my training expenditures, specifically what he called vanity certifications and personal coaching sessions. He claimed it was a misuse of funds, but said the company was being generous with their severance package. The severance document was an insult, a standard template that offered 12 weeks of salary in exchange for a complete release of all claims, a strict non-disclosure agreement, and a waiver of all voting rights attached to my equity. They believed I was desperate enough to sign away my life's work for a temporary financial cushion. I looked at Bradley, who was tapping his fingernails on his tablet, clearly eager to get this chore over with so he could brag about disruptive management. My fountain pen was a gift from the founding chief executive officer, given to me on the day we signed our first $10 million contract. The gold nib felt cold and heavy in my hand, a physical anchor to the company's true history. I signed the acknowledgement of receipt, but I did not sign the waiver. Bradley did not even notice the difference. He was already looking at his watch. As I walked out of the conference room, the hallway was silent. The junior managers I had trained and protected for a decade suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Nobody wanted to catch the eye of the man who had just been eliminated. They did not understand that I was not leaving. I was simply changing my position on the board. The elevator ride down to the lobby was the longest 30 seconds of my life, but my mind was completely clear. I turned and walked out. Outside the glass doors stood two security officers. One was Dwight Cole, who had worked the night shift for 5 years. I had written his recommendation letter for his promotion. He held the door open for me. He muttered that this was wrong and that I deserved better. I looked him in the eye and said I would settle for justice. He smiled, wishing me luck. I walked straight out of the building. I did not carry any boxes or look back. The autumn air was cold, waking me up. I went to a cafe across town where I had met the board chair, Eleanor Briggs, 6 months earlier. Eleanor was already waiting in a corner booth, sipping black tea. She was 81 years old, sharp-witted, and wore a simple gray wool coat. She had been one of the original investors who believed in the company before we had a physical office. When I laid out the evidence of Bradley's self-dealing and the forged approvals, her mouth set into a thin, hard line. She agreed that the firm was in grave danger of regulatory investigations and that immediate action was required. I opened my folio, which contained my signed voting proxy, the shareholder motion, and the meeting agenda. I sent a text message to the board chair stating that everything was ready. She replied immediately, saying she would see me at 9 o'clock. By the time I reached my home office, the initial shock had faded, replaced by absolute focus. I sat at my desk and reviewed the corporate bylaws one last time. Under Delaware General Corporation Law, a board of directors is bound by fiduciary duties of care and loyalty. When an executive engages in self-dealing by transferring corporate funds to a personal associate under a forged agreement, they breach these duties. This makes the transaction void ab initio under the doctrine of corporate fraud. Bradley believed he was playing a game of corporate strategy, but he had violated federal copyright law and state penal codes. I packed my folders into my leather briefcase. I was not bringing anger to the meeting. I was bringing documented facts and the legal authority to enforce them. The boardroom was filled with the smell of warm pastries and fresh coffee when the directors took their seats at 8:55 on Monday morning. Gerald Finch was chatting with the board members, while Bradley Stone stood by the projector, looking confident. He began his presentation, boasting about a 9.2% increase in quarterly growth and a 40% reduction in departmental overhead. He did not mention my name, but everyone knew he was referring to the elimination of my department. Bradley was in the middle of explaining how his new efficiency model would eliminate another 20 positions in the fourth quarter, saving an additional $300,000 in operating expenses. He was grinning, confident that the board would applaud his ruthlessness. But the directors were silent, their eyes shifting to Eleanor Briggs, who sat at the head of the table. Before he could continue, Eleanor Briggs, the board chair, interrupted him. She stated that there was a procedural matter to address first. She looked toward the side door, and I walked in carrying my black folio. Bradley froze, stating that this was unexpected. I stepped to the table and laid my documents down. "Good morning," I said. Eleanor cleared her throat, explaining that under Section 12C of the revised bylaws, any equity partner holding a qualifying voting block could present a motion at the opening of the session. Bradley tried to speak, but the general counsel, Miriam Croft, confirmed that the motion was within my rights. I stated that I was exercising my right as an equity partner, holding 34.1% of the shares, backed by a majority coalition of 51%, to demand an immediate review of recent financial relocations and executive consulting approvals. I opened my folio and distributed the documents. I presented the records showing that my training expenses were fully pre-approved under legacy initiatives. Then, I turned to the second packet. I pointed out the $27,000 payment to Perform a Group LLC, a shell firm registered to Bradley's college roommate, Jared Webb. I showed the evidence that Bradley had forged the digital signature of former Chief Financial Officer Howard Miller to bypass compliance. This constituted forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, making the agreement void ab initio. I also presented the McKinsey White Paper, demonstrating that the submitted report was a direct copyright violation under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. The room went completely silent. Bradley's face turned pale, He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, but Miriam Croft confirmed that the company had no record of the vendor and that the signature was indeed unauthorized. Miriam Croft adjusted her reading glasses, her expression completely professional but her tone carrying the cold finality of a judge delivering a sentence. She did not look at Bradley as she spoke, keeping her eyes fixed on the documentation I had provided, ensuring every director understood the liability. She noted that under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a chief financial officer's signature on a binding contract was a criminal offense. Because the agreement was built on fraud, the transaction was void ab initio, meaning the company could not legally recognize or ratify the contract. Furthermore, she pointed out that using the plagiarized McKinsey report exposed the firm to statutory damages under Title 17, United States Code Section 106, for copyright infringement. The board members looked horrified. Even Gerald Finch, the chief executive officer who had brought Bradley into the company, realized the danger. He immediately raised his hand to support the motion of no confidence, eager to distance himself from the disaster. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The motion carried. Eleanor turned to Bradley and told him he was no longer employed by the company. Bradley stood up, stammering about his projects, but the chair remained firm, advising him to address his concerns through legal counsel. Bradley turned to me, his face filled with disbelief. I said nothing, simply maintaining eye contact. He looked to the board, then to the door, and finally walked out of the room. Leaving his folders behind, the chair cleared her throat, noting that under the revised bylaws, the board was required to appoint an interim chief executive officer immediately. Miriam Croft suggested someone with deep compliance experience and internal knowledge. The board members agreed, turning their eyes to me. Eleanor asked if I would be willing to serve as interim chief executive officer. I accepted. The transition was finalized, and my appointment was recorded in the minutes. I walked down the hallway to the executive suite, swiping my card. The light blinked green, and the door unlocked with a soft click. I sat at the mahogany desk, opening the bottom drawer to pull out my red folder. I explained that the succession plan Phase 2 contained a complete roadmap to stabilize the company. It outlined a strategy to restore our client relationships, rehire the key managers who had been pushed out, and audit all strategic operations. The directors listened in silence, nodding in agreement. They realized that the lifer they had ignored was the only one who could save the firm. This was never about revenge. It was about protecting what we had built. I looked out the window at the city below, ready to lead the company into its next chapter.